coffee early in the morning here in Kentucky. I'm an engineer and I dabble in chainsaws. And this video is for everyone. It's for beginners and those who use saws for a living. There are topics that are kind of interrelated with relation to chainsawing. So I don't have any choice but to go over each one kind of separately. So hang with me. It may seem like they're not related, but I'll try to tie them together. If you've never used a saw and you're just interested, maybe you'll find some of these topics worth watching. I'm using this really old 288 XP with factory felling spikes. Okay, so this is how the saw was set into the wood as it was cutting. And, I kind of did this motion here as I came down. When you do that, basically have a fulcrum here, kind of like you can consider it sort of a seesaw. And so you've got the distance between your fulcrum and the handlebar on the saw relative to the distance between the fulcrum and where the cutting is taking place. So in this case, if the fulcrum is set in here at the tree, the full bar is sunk in the tree, and you're pulling up on the handle, this is the situation where you have the minimum amount of down pressure that you can apply out here on the bar. So by changing angle and cutting a slightly different angle, the distance between the fulcrum and the saw handle is fixed, but the distance to the cutting surface is reduced. So you actually have more leverage because of this shorter distance. I'll demonstrate that with another cut. Kitty, kitty, kitty. Anyway, some of the topics to discuss are how the chain cutters cut, bar length, chainsaw power, leverage, pressure. A lot of people don't understand chainsaw felling dogs or felling spikes can have a tremendous effect on how a saw performs. Sometimes chainsaw dogs or felling dogs can transform the behavior of a chainsaw. There are a lot of different interrelated aspects to chainsaws, believe it or not. They're not really just simple little tools. There's kind of a lot going on, both with the saw and with the interaction between the saw and the wood. One fundamental topic to discuss is cutter pressure. What I mean by that is the force that presses the cutting teeth into the wood. When you're cutting a really small limb, whatever downforce is applied to the bar is focused on that small limb, on that small area. There may only be 2 or 3 or 4 cutters interacting with the wood at any one time. When this happens, the chainsaw is efficient. It can cut the wood, it can remove the chips, and make way for the next cutter to come through and cut the wood. However, when the bar is buried deep inside a large hardwood log, whatever pressure is applied to the saw, whether it be through the weight of the saw or pressure applied by the operator. There's a cat climbing in the building here. Hey, kitty, 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 kitty. Cats everywhere. Anyway, as the bar is buried deep, the pressure applied to each cutter is reduced. So each cutter can't take as aggressive a bite of the wood with each pass. And as the chips are created at one end of the cut, the chip has to be evacuated from the cut. In order to do that, the saw has to apply power to that chip to bring it back toward the saw and remove it. Well, in such a long cut, that chip doesn't pass freely all the way back. It's sometimes cut repeatedly by cutters that come behind it. So by the time it exits the cut, it may have been rolled and cut and diced and sliced more than one time. That takes horsepower to accomplish. So chip evacuation is one aspect of cutting efficiency that a lot of saw users do without thinking about. Another aspect is horsepower and torque of the saw that you're using. There are people who know a lot more about chainsaw power and torque and porting and chainsaw behavior, gas chainsaws, much more than I. But here's a graph of torque and horsepower on a modern some popular models of chainsaw. There are people who know a lot more about power and torque and performance of a high performance gasoline 2-stroke chainsaw than I. But I know some of the basics. I know that chainsaws produce torque and they produce horsepower. And so I know if you stay, there are extremes of operation. And you want to keep the saw within an RPM range where it can do its most efficient work. And that comes with practice, and it comes by necessity also, because if the chainsaw is over revved with no load, the RPMs go way up and there's very little horsepower available to cut and very little torque available to continue to pull the chain through the wood. As the RPMs go down a little bit and more load is applied, the chainsaw operates with better efficiency, higher horsepower and higher torque. If the chain and saw are overloaded, if they're cutting too much wood or cutting with too much down pressure, or there are other factors, if the saw is pinched, if there's too much resistance, then RPMs will drop further and the saw will perform even worse with lower torque and lower horsepower. So there's a medium that has to be struck with a gas chainsaw in order to cut efficiently. There's another relationship between RPM, saw RPM, and torque. Now I'll mention too, when we're discussing torque and horsepower, electric chainsaws are becoming more popular. And they're good. There are legitimate uses for those saws, and they're performing well in the field. I'm starting to hear that there's development for different types of chaps and protective gear for electric saws versus gas saws. Because again, if you look at this chart, torque is low and RPM is low on a gasoline saw. So the chaps are designed to stop a gasoline saw when the saw is running quickly and the cutters are turning quickly. However, many electric saws have torque at much lower RPMs, and they can actually overcome the safety gear. So there are developments in that respect. So this also applies to the use of felling dogs or felling spikes, because felling spikes are sometimes used to add down pressure to the bar and add load and torque to the saw. Therefore, felling spikes and felling dogs could be even more useful on a saw that has torque on the low end, because rather than carefully balancing the power output and torque output, an operator could potentially just apply as much down force as possible and cut as quickly as possible and just leave the electric saw turned wide open. So this is something to look for on the horizon. But anyway, I forgot where I was going with this. My wife doesn't think these clothes look professional. Maybe they don't. But it's kind of cool here in the shop, so I think I'll run with these clothes for now. When cutting with a saw, you have the option to muscle the saw, as I call it, or you can work the saw. What I mean by that is, while cutting, say you're bucking a log on the ground, one option is to hold the saw and cut the log. Just go straight through, hold the saw in the air, prevent the saw from going toward the wood, and just cut. That takes effort. Pulls on your back and pulls on your arms. I'm not quite as young as I used to be. I don't like to do that. I like to work more efficiently. So the typical way to use felling dogs is to apply throttle to the saw, push the saw into the wood, push forward on the top handle, pull up on the rear handle, and this forces the bar into the cut. Now the saw can be repositioned, and this process can be repeated until the wood is cut. This allows control of down pressure on the cut so that one can keep the saw in its most efficient RPM range and keep the pressure at a level where the cutters do their most efficient cutting and chip removal. One thing I don't hear many people talking about is the aspect of oiling, the chainsaw bar oiling. Now, a chainsaw chain needs oil. It needs to be lubricated as it's cutting wood, or else it'll get too hot and that can damage the chain, can damage the bar, and damage the saw. So RPM and torque and power, chain speed affect chain speed. Down pressure affects chain speed. Chainsaw power affects chain speed. Bar length affects oiling. So that all has to be considered. What I'm saying is that felling dogs shouldn't be overused in order to provide too much cutting pressure, because when that happens, chain RPM drops too low to properly oil the bar. High RPM is good for oiling, and it's good for chip evacuation. So it's my opinion that a saw should be run somewhere between max torque and max horsepower in order to get the best out of the saw and the best out of the interaction between the chain and the cut. So say a large powerful saw starts to cut into a big hardwood log. As the cut begins, there may be adequate down pressure and good cutting. As the bar gets halfway through the wood, there are things in play here. There's less pressure on each cutting tooth. There's difficulty evacuating chips, which takes more power from the saw. There's more drag on the chain as it goes through the cut because there's more of it. There's more notch. There's more kerf to drag the chain through. There could be pinching, saw pinching, to add drag to the saw. So what people have learned to do just through experience is to cut, change position of the saw, cut, change position again, and cut. Now this changes the angle. This changes the pressure, force divided by area. Changes the pressure on the cutting teeth, evacuates chips in a more efficient manner, keeps the chain running fast for proper oiling, and it keeps the saw in the proper torque range for maximum horsepower and torque. You know, all this is fine and good on the ground, but there are people who use chainsaws to make a living climbing trees. I think this is amazing. But what are they to do without cutting teeth or cutting, felling dogs? What are climbers to do without felling dogs? I don't know how they would cut at all. I'm out of breath. We walked out here to the woods and climbed the tree. Certain tree pros use saws every day, way up in a tree. On a harness, how are you going to cut a tree without dogs? Going to pull a sit up each time? I don't think so. You're going to give it throttle, hit your dogs, and rotate. Cut after cut until you get to where you need to be. Trust me on this. I'm risking my very life just for the benefit of YouTube. You should listen to what I say because my videos are always completely truthful.
Daddy, are you playing in the tree again?
What? And you should always trust what I say because it's always completely truthful. Oops. And fellers, loggers, are in the same situation. When the tree is vertical and the saw is horizontal, the chainsaw, the weight of the chainsaw doesn't help push it through the wood. It doesn't help it to cut. So something has to be done to apply pressure to the cutting teeth, to the cutters, in order to go through the log. All this stuff is fine and dandy until the tree is vertical. What do loggers and tree climbing professionals do when they have to cut something vertical? They've got to be able to apply pressure to the cutters to cut the tree. Felling dogs are imperative for this. I've got a few examples on film. This will bring the idea home. These watch carefully and note that these chainsaw operators cut briefly, change position of the saw, and cut more. Also notice that they're pulling or pushing on the saw to create down pressure at the cut. Also, too, pay attention to chip evacuation and chip size. So the bottom line is not everyone needs felling dogs, but some people can definitely benefit from them. And some saws behave completely different depending upon the dogs that are installed.